Good morning, fifth graders. I'm coming to you live from my deck outside. It's a sunny day. If you can hear, lawn mowers and birds chirping, wind blowing, it's because I decided to work from outside today. Next time we get to have class, maybe you should have class outside as the weather gets nicer. But we're here today to talk about your science lesson that you're going to be working on today. You have an experiment to do, some materials to gather from home, but before you start that and you're testing, you need to know a little bit about what you're going to be testing, what you're going to be looking at and looking for. And so we're going to talk about two vocabulary words, porosity and permeability. We're just going to look at what those have to do with water and what those have to do with the rocks and soil. So this week you guys have been investigating soils, looking at the components of soil, seeing how they're different, how they're alike, looking at the shapes and properties of the different types of soil. And today, all of that is going to come into play as we talk about groundwater and how it moves, how it gets there. Groundwater is the water that's underneath the surface of the earth. So how water precipitation gets from surface water into the ground, how it moves through there, and what the composition of the rocks and soil has to do with that. So let's move on to the next slide. Movement of groundwater. It all has to do with the soil and rocks at the surface of the earth, and it depends on their properties, the components, what type of soil is there, determines how much water can seep into the ground and how fast it can seep into the ground and move through the different layers of the earth. So porosity is one of the factors we're going to talk about that determines that. And porosity is the amount of pore space, or the air, the spaces between the different particles of a substance like gravel or sand or the humus and clay. Those are the four different components that you guys looked at, and they all have, there's different amounts of porosity, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, so one of the things that is important with porosity is the shape and the way particles are sorted. You might think first like it has to do with the size. If all the particles are bigger, then there'll be more pore space, but that's not necessarily the case. So let's take a look down here. All of these three examples actually have high porosity. These have a large particle. The middle one has a medium-sized particle, and the smaller one has a small particle, the third one. And but actually they all have a similar amount of pore space or space between. Okay, so let's take a look at the example right here under high porosity. Remember, porosity is how much space is between each of the particles. And in the first example, we have large particles. So these are well sorted. That means they're the same size together. So all of these are large particles, and between them are large spaces. There aren't as many spaces between those large particles as would be between the other smaller particles, but they're larger. Then if you look at the second example, the particles are smaller. They're still all a similar size, and there's more pore spaces between them. And actually, the amount of space between these two examples is about the same. Okay, in the third example, you have really small particles, but there are more pore spaces even though they're smaller. So actually, the amount of space in example number 3 is the same as the amount of space in the example number 1 and 2. These have high porosity because they're well sorted. And that's what we talk about when the particles are all the same size stacked up together. An example of low porosity is when you have a poorly sorted type of rock or soil. That would be different size particles, and you'll notice that between the large particles, the medium and small particles fill up that space, and it actually leaves less pore space. So there's low porosity, or less space for water to travel through this type of soil. Okay, so that leads us to talking about permeability. And permeability is how fast and how much water can travel through the ground or through the pore space. So if there's High permeability, that's when lots of water can travel through, and there's a couple of key factors for that. High permeability needs large pore spaces, and they need to be well connected. So those spaces between need to have paths. They can't be blocked off. The water needs to be able to keep moving all the way through, like a path down there. The gravel or the sand that you guys have, those are two particles that create high permeability and allow the water to pass through pretty quickly. Some small pore spaces that are not well connected lead to low permeability. So that's here, and you can see these are more flat and square shaped. This is similar to like clay, where they're flatter pieces and they stack up and they don't actually allow a clear path. They're not well connected. So water that travels through here might get stuck and get trapped in and not be able to flow as quickly and easily. It might take a lot longer for water to travel through this type of soil. And so that would be a low permeability soil. So if you live in an area where the soil contains a lot of clay, it could be prone to more flooding. That's because the water won't be able to seep into the earth as easily, and so that water will remain on the surface and run through. If there's an excess of water, it won't be able to drain. However, if you live in a place with more gravel or sandy soil, water will pass through fairly easily. When there's low permeability, it can affect how much runoff and surface water there is if it can't get into the ground. And that can be problematic and cause problems like flooding. And so if you think about it, when we're planning cities and towns and we put pavement down on the road, that is a surface that has very low permeability. The water is not able to penetrate and get through pavement. And so city planners have to be really thoughtful. And so you might have noticed that there's things like drains in streets and in sidewalks to allow that water to pass through so it doesn't create floods and issues for houses and buildings and businesses that are in those cities. So it's an important thing to think about, and an important way that these issues, these ideas of permeability and porosity really impact our daily life. Ultimately, what you guys need to know is that the permeability and porosity of soils affect the way water is able to move through the earth. And this is just one of the ways that the hydrosphere and the geosphere interact on a regular basis.